I'm Khalil Gibran Muhammad.
And I'm Ben Austen. We're two best friends.
One black,
One white.
I'm a historian.
And I'm a journalist.
And now we have a new podcast. It's called Some of My Best Friends Are.
Like, I'm not a racist. Some of my best friends are... ...
And in this show, we're going to wrestle with the challenges and absurdities of a deeply divided and unequal country. Because we know after nearly 35 years of relationship that being a black guy and a white guy hanging out together is not going to get us to the promised land. Yeah, but this comes pretty close.
This is the promised land.
Yeah, this definitely feels like the promised land today.
Yeah. At least for South Shore.
Nah, man, for everywhere. That's Chicago is everywhere. This city is a microcosm of the world, right?
Well, this was the promised land in the Blues Brothers.
Yep.
This is where they make it at the end for the big benefit concert.
Listen, we are so excited that you're with us today. This is as close to a homecoming as we could ever imagine, and being able to do this together. So thank you so much for coming out today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we want to make this as much an actual live podcast as it is an occasion to engage you about this city and what it means to us. So sometimes we're just going to talk to each other like we do when we're actually recording in our closets. Ben here in Chicago, and I'm in South Orange, New Jersey. And then sometimes we're going to talk to you directly. Does that sound good?
All right. So we want to know, how many people have heard the podcast before? All right.
Man,
Chip?
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. We won't ask you whether you like it or not, but we're grateful that you are actually listeners.
So if you haven't heard it, as you heard, that's the intro to the show. And it's a podcast called Some of My Best Friends Are, which is, this kind of trope of, I guess you could say, bigotry, where people will say, and here we are in a country club, so, former country club, so it makes sense in a way, that I'm not a so-and-so, some of my best friends are. And, part of the show is us as a historian and journalist investigating race and, those kinds of tropes of racism.
Yeah. And we cover a lot of ground, so we've done a show, one of my favorite shows is on tennis. And we talk about tennis as a way of really getting at the absurdities of this country. We talk about having played tennis here together. We talk about Katrina Adams, who many of you may know went to Whitney Young, played professionally on the women's circuit, was the first black person to head the USTA, and since I was spending some time in Harlem for a time, actually ran the Harlem Junior Tennis League. So, thinking about how leadership itself expresses itself both in tennis, and of course we talked a lot about Serena Williams.
And it's also called Some of My Best Friends Are because we're actually best friends.
Sometimes.
Of many years.
Yeah. So with that, we'll talk a bit more about our origin story. We'll talk a bit more about our own relationship to this city. But I wanted to kind of surprise Ben with something, and I want you all to participate. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of a lightning round of some Chicago themes, of places, of names, of personalities. And I'm going to ask Ben to pick one. And so he's going to give an answer. But I want you to take the first one and the second one as an A and a B. And I just want you to yell out after Ben has answered which one you would choose. And then we'll see how closely the audience in general aligns with Ben's sense of Chicago, all right? So you're only gonna say an A or a B because if you said the thing itself, it would sound like madness in here, okay? So all you have to do is say A, B, and then I'll kind of roughly judge which one is most consonant with what Ben has selected. He's gonna get two choices in these, all right? Everyone got it? All right, let's get started. All right, so these are basically choices of favorites. Geno's or Giordano's?
Giordano's. So B.
All right, so it looks like Geno's wins. Tribune versus Sun-Times.
Ooh, that's a hard one. A before, B now.
Tribune versus Sun-Times? No, mixed. We'll call that one a mix. Sox versus Bulls. Because
A.
nobody likes the Cubs, let's be honest, right?
A. 1.5 games out.
Bulls, okay, Bulls get that one. Michael Singletary or Brian Urlacher?
A.
All right. Taste of Chicago versus Annual House Party.
Yeah. B.
Now you guys are answering before Ben. You're leading the witness. Common or Kanye?
Common.
That is definitive. Most definitive response yet. Harold's or J&J's?
Harold's, come on. A.
Carson's or Marshall Fields?
B. Marshall Fields.
All right. Evergreen Plaza or River Oaks?
Ooh. So if you wanted a baseball cap, A, but a movie theater, B. This is like total 80s. And you're from the 1980s, that is.
Yeah. So, of course, some of this is a little bit historical. I had a question about Funtown versus Great America, and I thought, I'm not sure Ben even ever went to Funtown.
Yeah.
All right.
I know the jingle.
Almost done here. 4th of July, fireworks or gunshots?
Boo.
No,
Boo.
I mean, just it's celebration. Come on. If you're a South Sider or a West Sider, you know there's a choice there. Candyman 1 or Candyman 2?
A. Candyman 1.
All right. I suspect not as many of you saw Candyman 2. Ron Kittles or Harold Baines?
Ron Kittle, A.
You lose that one.
Those are White Sox players from the 1980s, if you don't know, everybody.
All right. Scottie Pippen or Derrick Rose?
Scottie Pippen, A.
All right.
We could do this for the whole hour.
I
Is
know.
that your plan?
Two more. Ribs and Bibs versus Leon's.
So Ribs and Bibs is a restaurant from also that burned down like 6 times. and I'm gonna choose it. A. You could get a bag of French fries there for 99 cents that would had enough calories for a teenager that could last you a week.
See, I also grew up in Chatham as opposed to South Shore. We'll talk a little about that. So Leon's Barbecue on 83rd and Cottage Grove, definitely a winner. All right, the final question. Harold Washington, go ahead.
Khalil or Ben?
No. Harold Washington or Barack Obama?
Harold Washington. A.
All right. Well, thank you all for
That's pretty rough, though. That's So, we did grow up in the 1980s, and we met as freshmen at Kenwood High School. So 35 years ago, I don't know how long now, almost. So it's been a while.
You're getting old.
Yeah, I'm feeling it.
Yeah. And so just to place this moment in context, we're here at South Shore Cultural Center. I mean, I remember walking by here as a kid. I literally spent my earliest years at 69th and Oglesby, which is 4 blocks from where we are, just across the street, at a place that was a nondescript apartment building, but I went to a nursery pre-K place called Toddler's Inn. So Ben...
Yeah, I grew up in South Shore, so I grew up not too far from here and played tennis here when it was called the South Shore Country Club, but wasn't really a country club anymore. And actually people from my neighborhood helped preserve it and then restore it. Yeah. There was sort of a discussion about what would happen, what its next iteration would be, and here we are.
Yeah, no, it looks great. So we wanted to just say, for those who don't know us, I mean, this is truly home. And we recently participated in an exercise where we were somewhere else talking about how do you define the South as part of your identity, and particularly for Black people with this tortured history of white supremacy and racism and slavery. Like, how do you make sense of a Southern identity? And we were kind of inspired by that to think about this conversation today.
Yeah, I mean, at first I thought we were going to talk about the death of Queen Elizabeth.
No. Yeah, no. I told Ben earlier that I kind of grew up with the Queen. I was okay with it, but this whole king thing is not sitting well with me.
So we, here we are in Chicago, and we're in a city that's demonized all the time, and that has all sorts of population changes going on. And even with a mayoral race, heating up, there's so many discussions about the city in its present form and its future. And so this question of well, what does it mean to be a Chicagoan? What is a Chicago identity? And a way to come at that is just to talk, at least at the start, of what it means to us.
Yeah. So our producers of the show often tell us our listeners only care so much about Chicago. So since we're here, we get to lean into that a little bit and actually talk about our origin story.
Yeah, so let's start with a Chicago. What is your Chicago origin story?
Yeah.
How did you get here?
Yeah. So you heard I teach at Harvard, which is, what you think it is, really snobby and arrogant and this sort of thing, but a lot of smart students.
Hey, everybody. That's how long it took him to mention Harvard. That's the longest so far. It's a guaranteed. There it is.
Whatever. So it came up because I was teaching just this week, and we were talking about the fact that I happen to be a third-generation Chicagoan. So my parents were born here. Shorty Ruff, by the way, for a listener, sends her regards. This is my mother's nickname, as a tough customer. My mother was born here. Her mother was born here, and that's the third generation. And so it happens, my great-grandmother, Laura Oliver, married in the 1920s a man named Eugene Gavin.
And this is your mother's side of the family?
This is my mother's side of the family, who migrated from Mississippi. They both migrated from Mississippi. They could not marry there, but they married here in the 1920s. And so I take a measure of pride of actually being basically descendants of people who got here at the turn of the century, or not quite the turn of the century, but in the 1920s, and therefore the early Great Migration.
Yeah, so you have a lot of roots here.
A lot of roots.
So I was born here, and my parents, who were in the audience, moved.
Wave, Austins, yes.
They moved to Chicago in their early 30s. My father got a job at the University of Chicago, so I guess I'm does that make me a first generation?
You're a first gener.
And they stayed. They moved here and stayed, which is another sort of, cities are measured in some ways by their, their ability to attract people and attract business and then to retain them.
Right.
And so, you're talking about the black migration and, before that, the beginning of the 20th century and even before immigrants from Europe. And in the 1990s, so many people from Mexico who moved here, and to the point that Latinos are a third of the population now.
Do you have some Latino heritage? This is the
No,
first
I'm just
okay, got
I'm
it.
just riffing here.
So
yeah, and then I'd say that my wife and I had a kind of professional walkabout where we moved all over the country, and decided at some point about 10 years ago that we wanted to come back home. And we wanted our kids to be raised here around our family, and this is where we wanted to make our stand. When you live in other cities, there's a kind of great freedom at times of not being rooted there, where you don't have to worry so much about the messy history. You don't have to own it. Right. And here you have to own it, but the stakes are higher.
Yeah. So I have moved from Chicago since essentially I was 22 years old. So unlike Ben, I haven't been back. And I've been enjoying the city by virtue of family and relatives who live here. My mom lived here until quite recently. Her entire life had never lived literally anywhere else. So I'm a little bit opposite to Ben in that I chose not to come back to Chicago.
But is this a good place to make your announcement?
about the return?
No, the run for mayor.
Yeah. Well, isn't everybody doing that?
You want me to bring that up?
Inside joke is I said if I ever came back to Chicago, I'd want to come back to be mayor. So this is actually real talk. But I want to say just one more thing about the other side of my family, which is more famous. And again, listeners of the show at least know this. So turns out that Ben lives today a couple of blocks from where my great-grandfather, Elijah Muhammad, who was also a migrant from Georgia, born in 1899, arrived in Chicago sometime in the 1930s, and ultimately built the Nation of Islam, which, if all of you know, is part of the Hyde Park, Kenwood area, and where Ben and Daniela's family currently live. And of course, that's another kind of Chicago story that makes not only the city quite unique and interesting, but also makes this entire area, and thinking about a Chicago identity, fascinating. I mean, something we talked about when we were thinking about the show, like where else in America could you imagine like Muhammad Ali, Elijah Muhammad, Jesse Jackson, eventually Michelle and Barack Obama, sort of all, and Harold Washington, as nodes of some of the most important political debates, movements in America. Pretty awesome.
And so we talked about, what are our Chicago origin stories, but there's a way where to feel like there's also a consciousness about being a Chicagoan, a kind of Chicago being sort of imprinted on your DNA. And we were younger before people really got tattoos of like the Chicago flag or anything like that, or 312 tattoos or 773 or. Oh,
all right.
So, let's talk about that moment where we really sort of started to think of Chicago as integral to our identity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it. All right, you first.
Okay. For me, it had to do with driving. And I could think of a specific moment. I think it's the summer after high school. So this is like 1989, and maybe it was 1990. And I had a job as a bagel delivery man.
I remember that.
And
didn't you have the white pickup truck then?
I had. See, you had to make it scary. I had a job as a bagel delivery man, and I had to get up at 5 a.m. And it was called the Bagel Nosh, and it was a bagel store on Rush Street. And Rush Street of 1989 or 1990 was sort of like in transition. That if you're older, Rush Street signifies kind of, something, a red light district, or sort of like kind of sleazy a little bit. And today it's pretty gentrified and ritzy. It was sort of both at that moment, or like probably more on the sleazy side. And I'd get there at 5 a.m. and I'd have to pull in an alley behind the shop and like flash my brights to clear out all the rats who would scurry away. And then I would load up the truck with bagels and drive all over the city. And there was a feeling of, as a young person too, of moving through the city at a time when there weren't a lot of people there, and where it felt like I kind of had ownership of the city. It felt like something out of like a Carl Sandburg poem, where like this Goliath, which is asleep.
He's getting literary on us, folks.
And here I am, seeing, and part of the mechanism that's going to be when it wakes. And the only other people out there were other delivery people, the newspaper trucks and things like that. And also traversing the city in a way that I hadn't before either, of going through the Loop, but also like the South Side, and you'd have to come back on State Street, down the State Street corridor where there were, used to be public housing for miles. And I just felt like I got a better understanding of the city, of being a part of it, of its geography and its segregation. And I felt at that point like a kind of pride of place.
Yeah. So, people often say that you have to leave a city to actually appreciate what you've lost or what you had. And I think of this kind of consciousness, Chicago consciousness, in a slightly different way. So I was about 9 years old when my father moved to New York. He'd left Chicago. He'd worked at Johnson & Johnson Publishing as a photographer. He spent an entire career as a photojournalist. But he got his start with Johnson Publishing. And he leaves for Charlotte in 1978, lands in New York by 1980, and he's still there. So I visited him about 9 years old for the first time, and I'm visiting with his friends, his new New York area friends who have kids. And the mom in this relationship is keeping me for the weekend, because by then my father was a bachelor, and so he's keeping me for the summer, where I really spent a lot of childhood summers from about 9 to 15 or 16. And so I meet this brood of kids of all ages, younger than me, older than me. They welcome me into their family. And within seconds of talking to them, someone's like, "You have a funny accent." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they were like, "You just said 10." And I was like, "What? 10?" They're like, "No, 10." I was like, "No, 10." Anyway, it was my Mississippi accent by way of Chicago that these New Yorkers who were my peers as kids were picking up on. And that was literally the first moment when I thought to myself, holy smokes, like I sound different.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's then you had to be like us and them. And I'm on team us. I'm on team Chicago.
Well, it did make me very proud. This is just
Did you do the thing where you then like went home and like practiced so you didn't say, you said 10?
Well, you know, I wanted to get to Harvard eventually, so I had to get rid of the accent.
I mean, so I had something similar. I mean, and maybe everyone does who's from Chicago, where you travel, and maybe this is even more of a white thing, where you meet people and they're like, "Oh, you're from Chicago, I'm from Chicago," and I would always call it like the double question.
Yep.
Because the next question was, "Where are you from?"
Right.
Not from Chicago. They want to know if you're from Deerfield or
Winnetka.
Yeah, or Winnetka or whatever. They didn't really mean
Markham.
Chicago.
Yep.
And so there's also that, you know, not just defining it of another city, but of like suburb or city.
Right, yeah. So I wanted to talk about the first time I remember being pissed off as a Chicagoan too. And that is when I was about 10 years old, I had to commute to Chatham from Regents Park where I lived by that age. And this was mostly,
Regents Park is a apartment building in Hyde Park.
51st and Lakeshore Drive to this day. You can actually see it on a clear day from just outside this window. And I was essentially going to this elementary school at 83rd and St. Lawrence called Dixon Elementary, and my mom just wanted continuity. So rather than me coming to go to Ray or something like that, I stayed going to Dixon. So I had to catch the number 1 from Lakeshore Drive to Cottage Grove, and the number 4, Cottage Grove from 51st to 83rd Street.
Deep Chicago cuts here.
Deep Chicago. And I remember one winter day, it was about negative 40 degrees, as was commonly true back in those days, in the early 80s, when global warming wasn't what it is today. And the bus took forever to come. When it finally arrived, it was so full with people, it didn't even stop at the light. And this is a memory seared in my memory. I literally screamed out of frustration, picked up the nearest rock I could find, and hurled it at the back of the bus. I mean, this is not a prideful moment, but it is the moment when I thought, like, this city sucks, right? Like, I'm trying to get to school, and I'm freezing. So that was the story.
Yeah.
Last one I want to tell about being a Chicagoan is, so you heard about the Schomburg Center, which is a cultural institution in Harlem, been around since the 1920s, really important place. But for anyone who's visited Harlem, has anyone visited Harlem in this audience? Okay, you know, Harlemites think that Black Harlem is as used to be called, the Negro capital of the world. And therefore, tremendous amounts of pride in that place. Yeah. And I kind of spent the first couple of years as the director of the Schomburg in 2011, kind of pushing back against that. I mean, like literally from the stage of the institution, reminding them that Harlem had never produced the political geniuses and the political greats that Chicago had produced, going back to Oscar DePriest, who was the first Black person to go to Congress after Reconstruction, and that Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who of course is the famous congressman, didn't get there to 1944. And then of course all the other stuff leading up to President Obama and all that was just gravy. But I felt very prideful in Harlem, reminding them that my city was actually better.
Yeah. So that makes me think that there's another way that you get a Chicago consciousness. Or that for us, like we're as professionals, we've also studied Chicago. I've written about Chicago. It's part of our work.
Yep.
And so maybe we just talk about that a little bit, about approaching the city when it becomes an idea that you are grappling with in that way. And one of the things I started when, as you know.
So you've written this book. Tell everyone about.
Well, I wrote my first book is about public housing in Chicago. It's about Cabrini Green. It's called High Risers. But and working on it, I also started to think about how little Chicago as a subject was part of my education. Mm-hmm. Was that true for you too? Did you ever have like?
Yeah, no. Formally, we talked about this a lot. Like, situating ourselves as kids in this important city, we don't remember like being taught about this first black mayor in the moment and the significance of that as something transformational, both for national politics, but also for the meaning of the city itself, even though we literally lived, in the same neighborhood as Harold Washington did.
Yeah, I don't even remember, when I say remember, meaning it could have happened, I just wasn't paying attention. But being assigned books like The Jungle or,
Upton Sinclair's muckraking book, we all remember.
Richard Wright books, Native Son, A Black Boy. Those were not books as part of the curriculum.
You didn't take the African American literature elective at Kenwood.
Was that part of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Okay,
yeah.
see.
You were still wrestling with your whiteness, Jewish identity kind of thing. It was still.
So yeah, it was not so prevalent. So I think part of it was like just going back and devouring everything. Studying the history of the city and the literature about the city, and if you're going to be a Chicago writer, to try to learn everything about it.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting question about the choices we made, because I don't think, our parents are here. I adopt Ben's parents as my own. My mom is not here with us, or my dad, but neither one of us, I think, knew then as teenagers, and we've got high school buddies here, that we would go on to actually write histories of one kind or another, either as a journalist or as an academic. And I think it's something about the richness of everything we experience in a community of people nurturing us that made it possible to look back and later see the city as something worth knowing. So for example, Ben's father is University of Chicago professor emeritus. We both were at Regenstein as kids, but by accident, I ended up writing about the University of Chicago in my work because it was the first real place for the study of the city. And the study of the city as a place of immigrant assimilation, the study of the city as, quote unquote, back then, race relations. And here we were, literally part of this community, products of it, and then later able to look back on it.
Yeah, and I think we write about it, and other people do too, because the city is endlessly fascinating. That the history and the present is so wrought with that history of problematic stuff and interesting things, and it's alive in so many ways. I think about now that there's this John Burge curriculum in the public schools.
Right. You want to tell them who John Burge is?
John Burge, the police officer who was part of a midnight crew on
literally tortured
a station house.
200 people.
Yeah, tortured more than 100 men, black men, into false confessions. And as part of reparations, the city agreed to teach this curriculum. That's I think we've talked about this before, even on the show when we were talking about critical race theory, that I think both of us believe professionally and personally that you have to engage with the really messy and difficult history of a place.
Yeah.
And that is what is, you talked about on the bus in Chicago and hating the city. This is a tough city to love.
Yeah.
This is a city that hurts you.
Yeah.
And to be in love with it is like being in an abusive relationship sometimes.
That's how I feel in the relationship with you.
I hope not. I hope not. Like, it's dysfunctional. And it is all of the magnificent things, and it is the richness of the history, which is so fraught with who we are as a country and as a city, that makes us an important place, and a place to try to make it better in some ways.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to also think about some influences. So we haven't talked about this on the show, but I think it's fair to say, like, your brother, Jake Austen, is here.
Famous Jake Austen.
And we all went to high school together. Jake is a couple of years older than us, but we had that experience. We all went to Kenwood. And your brother was, in many ways, a booster for the city, long before you and I were even thinking about these issues. Both as a zine editor and being able to describe the music scene in the city. I wasn't paying that close attention, but enough attention to know that this is what Jake was doing. He began writing about the city.
He literally has a TV show called Chicagoan. I mean, you can't be more of a booster than that.
Exactly.
With a theme song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to sing it?
No, but if in the podcast version of it, this is when it would kick
Ah,
in.
that's right.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for this episode when
Yeah.
it comes out. So I think to come back to a point about our Chicago consciousness, about how we ourselves came to own and help to define and really be part of telling stories about the city and its importance, is also about the relationships of the people who are with us.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about a harder subject, which
Yep.
is, nobody really talks about Chicago now without talking about, say, the violence.
Right.
And you're either, when you even talk about being a booster, you're sort of saying there's more to the city than that, but you're actually sort of responding to it, or you're engaging with it.
Yeah.
And it really is part of every conversation here.
And I wanted to actually pick up on a theme, because you've sort of already talked a little bit about this, but a lot of the work that I do as an academic is around policing. And at one point, someone asked us, we met someone earlier today, said, what inspired you to do the show? And the short answer is that we had an opportunity through the Pushkin, which is a company co-owned by Malcolm Gladwell, the journalist and writer, and Jacob Weisberg. But the idea of the show came because I was doing academic work on the criminal justice system. I'd written about it as a historian, and I was doing work with other social scientists around how to think about a different kind of policing. And Ben was actually reporting on policing in the early days of Black Lives Matter, sort of from the Michael Brown moment to the Laquan McDonald moment, and was on the ground reporting around the city about various forms of activism.
Yeah.
And talking about the tough stuff, like for us, it was not just the tough stuff and the questions about like what's wrong with your city, but it was also about trying to answer these tough questions and to think about like what's the future of the city? Like, is this a moment for us in different capacities to talk through what it means to solve for these problems?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know that as a Chicago writer, that I often I am trying to push against the stereotypes of the city. The Chirac image, or there's a Republican running for governor now, and he's been really pushing this idea of the Chicago as hellhole, of sort of adopting the language.
It's American carnage. This is a version of Trumpism.
Adopting the Trump language to sort of, it's also fear of crime in Chicago and sort of bail reform, but it's an easy dog whistle, and it's probably even more explicit than dog whistle to rile up people. I did a reporting project once, not too long ago, where I went around to 20 high schools in the city, and my idea was I would interview and profile all the valedictorians of all these different high schools.
I remember
that they're as much representative of the city
right.
and children in the city and in the public school system as either victims or perpetrators of violence.
Right.
And in some ways much more representative of most students.
Yeah.
And that was a thing.
It was great.
It was an amazing thing to even just like to be inside 20 different high schools across the city.
Yeah. So I take a much shorter version of like how to defend against the negative stereotypes, and that is I just tell people Chicago is the greatest beach town on earth. It's
beach town.
Where else can you have access to this amazing lake, like at just crossing a bridge? It's amazing. So yes, that's the simple version.
Yeah.
But here we are, right? And here we are. I got here on Friday, and on the hour-and-a-half drive, which was about as long as it took to fly here on the East Coast, to Hyde Park, WBEZ was reporting on the killing of a 17-year-old blocks away from our high school. He was out at lunch.
A Kenwood High School student.
Kenwood High School student.
Middle of the day, 12:35.
Yeah, and also was killed in a parking lot on East End, which is the very parking lot I crossed for 10 years of my life to leave my apartment building to come to high school or to go anywhere else from Hyde Park.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, of just this young man. I think he just transferred to the school this year, and this beautiful start to the school year. I've been walking around the neighborhood and seeing Kenwood students out and about playing, football and practicing band and lacrosse, and just so energetic. And to think this his life is over. And as much as I'm saying of pushing against the stereotype and writing about other things, this is a fact.
Right.
It happened.
Right.
And the reverberations are real.
Yeah.
People make choices at that point to leave the city, to not send their kids to Kenwood High School, to get away.
Yeah.
Why would I, if that's where danger is? And then there's all the sort of like political things that happen. In this case, the school board accusing Lori Lightfoot of not keeping children safe, of asking for more policing, all these other things that we know intellectually, like there's no police officer that can stop that crime.
Right.
You can respond to it in some way, and then you could say like maybe they could hunt these people down, but it's not a policing issue. But something happened that is both real and undeniable, and really tears at the fabric of our community.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben and I have been talking a lot about the depopulation of the city, and Ben's been doing some writing about it more generally. It's personal. I mean, I think that's the point. It's personal. It's not just our neighborhood, and it's not just the people who are 1 degree removed. As you know, a year ago there were a series of just outrageous shootings in Hyde Park that we actually talked about in one of our episodes, and so here we are again. Many of you know my mom left the city after having purchased a handgun for personal protection, and told me, that her handgun was on its way, and I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like she's in her apartment on the Citizen app, and as far as she's concerned, they're coming for her eventually.
And she's got a shaky hand.
Yeah,
She is not. She should not be handling a firearm.
This is not good. But I think, so now she's with us. But I think we don't want that, right? So the challenge for us, as people who do get to speak on behalf of the city, whether we get it right or wrong in terms of how we describe Chicago, the challenge for us is to simultaneously be honest about what these existential realities mean for people who live their lives here every day, and simultaneously push back against the bad ideas that push us towards a past that is not the source of the solution in this case.
Yeah.
So when Ben talks about policing won't save us, like we do have to remember that in any instance, police are reactive to violence. They actually, unless we could imagine a future where there are checkpoints on every corner, which did come up in some of the conversation about what happened at the University of Chicago last year, or in the 53rd Street area.
Yeah.
But as we know, that's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. So we have to think about what do we want in terms of an infrastructure that is healthier, that is safer, that is more about economic security for people, and not to say that those guys who killed this guy needed more money in their pockets and it wouldn't have happened. But what we're really talking about is a kind of society we live in where guns are ubiquitous, poverty is growing, and therefore the combination of people feeling like they're at the short end of a stick and they're operating on short fuses is something we can do something about.
Yeah. And I think it's not on the other hand, but in moments like this, we also have to recognize that there is some immediate need, that people are hurting and they're full of fear and they need something. And in the void of good ideas, there'll be sort of these old ideas that have been tried already and we know don't work.
Right.
But that there really is trauma, there's suffering right now.
Yeah.
And there's something, devastating. And I mean, in other neighborhoods, in many places, it's why, it happens a lot. But when it's very close to home, you see it up close. You have to recognize that.
Yeah. So let's leave folks with 3 good ideas about the future, right? So 3 good ideas. 1, we really do have to make sure that we give young people summer youth employment and massive recreational opportunities. Both of us had them.
Yeah.
Really important.
Yeah.
Because we know, I'll just use the social science research tells us that kids who actually get to work at 14 put money in their pocket, kids who there's no barrier to the recreational opportunities they want or the ways to explore their own creative expression do much better than kids who essentially have a lot of free time. Two, we want to make sure that we invest in violence interruption.
Yeah.
Chicago is really one of the birthplaces for this idea, but Chicago's been one of the hardest places for violence interruption to take root. It is being exported to Jacksonville, Baltimore. New York is one of the places with the most significant investment in violence interruption. And so one of the things that we don't know, we still haven't learned exactly what set this off, but violence interrupters get ahead of it. They actually do the work that police can't do, which is that they have trust within those communities. They're able to talk people off the ledge so that they're not inclined to use violence because, as public health experts say, violence is a disease, and it is contagious. And once you catch it, you are much more likely to express it. So those two ideas about investing in our young people, as well as investing in actual things that work to keep people from killing people, to me are very productive. And it's no reason why Chicago can't invest in those rather than continuing to have a conversation in this next mayoral race about how much policing, how much more policing.
Yeah, and we're reminding ourselves that I was talking about the governor's race, and when the Republican candidate called Chicago a hellhole, there was an online sort of social media response of, post something about Chicago that is, conflicts with that shows its beauty, and don't just show the skyline. And, this is a place full of love, and this is a place full of beauty. And those things are not erased. They're side by side with a lot of the problems, but they're not gone. They're always here too.
Yeah. So, we usually sign off the show in the way that most people know, and I think we're going to do the same.
Yeah.
But I want to add to that not only do I love you, man, but I love this city.
I love you, and I love this city too.
All right.
So we have a little time if anyone has questions or something to come up. Oh, you want to run it?
We've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A.
Great.
So if everybody who wants to ask a question could please raise their hands, and let's please keep it brief since we have 10 minutes, your name and your question, and let's leave the storytelling to Ben and Khalil. Anyone have a question?
I'm Stephanie from actual Chicago, not, Evanston, Chonburi.
Actual Chicago, love it.
We didn't talk tennis. Did you watch the Tiafo match?
She asked, did we watch the Tiafo match?
Oh, that's a great question. See, I love that. I did. It was amazing, the greatest tennis. I just, but I'll say I was watching the Serena Williams, and I actually was thinking about this, all the attention she was getting around her last tournament.
Her last hurrah.
And that if she had made it to the finals even, it would have changed American society. that the attention it would have grabbed, like we wouldn't be here right now. We would be all playing tennis. Like it would have. There was a tennis boom in the 1970s after some of the first televised matches.
Man, you are going on. She
asked
asked about Tiafo.
And I think it would have just changed everything. It was a moment that we kind of came close to experiencing.
Well, just to say quickly, I didn't know, and I hadn't thought about this, but in our tennis episode we talk about Arthur Ashe and others, but I didn't realize that no black man had made it to the U.S. Semifinals stage, U.S. Open semifinal stage, since Arthur Ashe in 1972. That's wild.
Yeah.
So we are super excited about this kid and his future. Just amazing.
Hi, Lauren. We don't have time to hear about all the mayoral candidates because that would take until next week. But what do you think ideally the qualities of a good mayoral candidate would be? Like, what would a good mayor look like? Because I don't think we know what that is anymore.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Someone who wears a Jackson Park t-shirt?
Oh, yeah.
Just jokes.
No, I mean, I do think there's a kind of soft politics that we're also really lacking, in addition to all sorts of hard politics of feeling united and feeling connected. You know, that people who are making terrible choices, that don't feel invested in this city or a part of it, who don't feel like they have anything to look forward to, that the responses to that, of even what you were talking about investment, need to take time, that they can't happen immediately. But somebody who is filling us with a sense of you know, collective efficacy, of connection, of that we're
Are you saying Lori Lightfoot isn't just a fountain of community beauty and spirit?
that there's some kind of there's some sort of spirit that is lacking.
Yeah.
So that's
On this conversation, and I'll admit I don't know the primary contender so much. One of them I know is in this community. Sophia King is one of them, and I've met Sophia through Ben and others, so have some sense of her as a person.
You played bid whist with her.
Played with bid whist, yeah. You're telling too much. But we have talked about Lori Lightfoot a lot, and I, sort of casually talked to Ben this weekend during this trip, and he's like, I'm like, she's done, right? He's like, no, she's probably the front runner. And I'm like, really? And part of my surprise, again, I'm not here in the city, I'm not reading the Times or the Tribune. Part of my surprise is like the disappointment I remember early on about her leadership. And the way that translated in our conversations was just like, what happens to these people when they take office? Is there like some secret binder of all the things you can no longer do that you promised on the campaign trail? And if you don't agree with it, we're going to wipe out your whole family process? Because it just seems to be that always happens.
Yeah. Well, that's a great reason for you never to enter politics. That's it.
No, I tell my wife, I say, I'd just be a one-term candidate, just burn everything down. No, I mean, lift everything up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Any other questions?
Any more questions?
Right here. Yes?
Thank you.
So one of the things the mayor did try to do was bring in the people from LA who redefined their police department and brought down their murder rate, and it kind of failed, and I kind of want to talk about if you've investigated in how to change policing as a way to reduce violence in the city.
Go ahead.
She said you were reporting on this.
No, but you're the police expert.
Well, I think, so we're talking about Charlie Beck. And the thing about Charlie Beck's work was that Charlie Beck worked with a woman named Connie Rice out of LA. And Connie Rice is, just by chance, Condoleezza Rice's cousin, but they're like opposites. Connie Rice essentially is a civil rights attorney that sued the LAPD after a series of just horrible corruption cases and executions by members of that force. And so in some ways, what grows out of that reform effort was the blunt instrument of litigation that ultimately forced the LAPD to change. Chicago has still not...
And her idea of sort of police as ambassadors in communities,
yeah.
Rather than sort of, whatever you imagine of not being a part of it,
yeah.
whether they're sort of...
Thank you, that's a really good point. And by mentioning that point, it actually tells another story inside of a story, which is that I don't think they fired the entire force, but they created the conditions under litigation to weed out people on the force who were not with the program. And this created the possibility for changing the culture of the LAPD. A similar thing happened in Camden, New Jersey, where they more or less did essentially wipe out the existing personnel and then try to rehire people, or go about rehiring and then retraining them. What I think is fascinating about this, with regard to whatever's possible in the city of Chicago in the future of policing, is a lot of people have had no scruples about essentially wiping out school systems and then essentially starting from scratch. But a lot of people are deeply uncomfortable with the notion that we ought to do the same in policing. And we've just given a couple of examples where some of this has happened. So I can't tell you that that's going to solve the problem entirely, but I can tell you it's a promising possibility.
So you're also saying that you're talking about the police union of being
Absolutely.
Obstructions to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We have time for one final question today.
I hope it's about tennis and not policing.
Yes.
Or maybe that was our final question. Oh,
We got one.
One in the back.
Well, this isn't about tennis. It's about the following
I
forum.
hope not. I hope it's not about tennis, actually.
No. It's about public education. I know that forum is next. But on the south side, I noticed, so we were talking about the mayor, and our last few mayors, they all sent their kids to private schools. So they're also over our public school education. But on the south side of Chicago, I noticed that, let's say, the white families and the black families with more means, they send their kids to private school. So this kind of furthers this divide in our city. I just want to know your thoughts on public education versus private school, namely on the south side.
I don't have,
Yeah, I think you're talking about lots of things, and there's also a structure of public schools here where we have selective enrollment schools and not neighborhood schools, so that if you can find your way into one of these better high schools, then you also leave your community. And we found many ways to both, like, as a kind of Band-Aid of in some ways to keep middle-class people in the city, to offer these opportunities. At the same time, they're eating away, they're eroding neighborhood schools. And we built, and this is what the next conversation's about, but also building so many charter schools right around public schools, continues to do that. We closed 20 high schools not too long ago because they were under-enrolled and underperforming. And then, of course, if you open 10 schools around them, you're going to lose enrollment. And so, yeah, it's like many things where that is a system-wide problem. The fixes are only furthering it, but not actually solving it.
And for us, I will just say, so my wife, who's here, Stephanie, who some of you know from the show, we live in suburban New Jersey. We live outside of Newark, in a town that shares a border with Newark. But even in our town, a version of Hyde Park, one could say, we have white people of means and black people of means who don't even send their kids to the suburban public school district. We sent our kids, our son went to high school for his freshman year, then we sent him to a parochial school because he was having a tough time with a couple of teachers. But our two daughters have gone to public school in this entire system. A lot more of us do have to make a choice about investing in these public institutions if we expect our schools to be, in the highfalutin language of Carl Schurz and others, the laboratories of democracy. This is where people learn to live together and work through difference to identify their commonalities and shared values. And we're going to have leadership in the city that affirms those values and incentivizes people to participate in those things. Because the end of this society is not just material accumulation and wealth accumulation to no end. It's also about how we learn to live together. And if there isn't a moment in our history right now that we see what illiberal democracy looks like, and America's only been a democracy for about 50 years, if we count what it means for everyone to participate in that system, then we have failed collectively in building our capacity to be the leaders that we claim to be. So this, to answer the question about the mayor, this is what we want to hear the next mayor of Chicago talk about. Wink, wink. All right, y'all. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.